At that dinner, in a small and humble place, eternity met time. The flickering light of oil lamps cast shadows that seemed to dance on the stone walls, while hearts were weighed down, betrayed by their own fears. It was not just a meal. Every gesture, every word, was the prelude to a struggle that would change the destiny of the world. Between the breaking of bread and the kiss of a traitor, the seeds of salvation were planted. The streets of Jerusalem were alive that night, as if the entire city were breathing in unison with the celebration of Passover. The sound of voices echoed through narrow alleys, mingling with the aroma of spices and roasted meat. Yet, while the crowd rejoiced, a silent weight followed every one of my steps. The disciples walked around me, but the silence between them was unusual. Even Peter, who always spoke with enthusiasm, remained quiet. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his eyes scanned the path ahead, as if searching for something he could not find. "Master," John finally said, his soft voice breaking the tension. He walked close to me, his gaze fixed on my face. "Something feels different tonight. I've sensed it since we left Bethany." I paused for a moment, observing the young disciple, whose serenity often contrasted with Peter's intensity. I gently placed my hand on his shoulder and smiled. "Yes, John. Tonight will be remembered for generations. But not everything will be easy to understand." I continued walking, but my words seemed to draw them deeper into their thoughts. My eyes fell on Judas, who was walking a little behind us. His posture was tense, as if every step were an internal struggle. He avoided my gaze, but I could feel the turmoil within his mind. We arrived at the upper room as the evening fell. The sun, sinking below the horizon, painted the sky in golden and orange hues. The door was open, and the aroma of fresh bread and herbs filled the air. "Let us enter," I said, my voice calm but firm. As we crossed the threshold, a heavy silence fell over the group. The space was simple, illuminated by oil lamps casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. A low table sat in the center, surrounded by cushions. There was no luxury, but there was something sacred, as if time itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. The disciples took their seats around the table, but not as they usually did. There was something different in the way they looked at each other, as if searching for something they couldn't quite name. Peter watched Judas with suspicion, while John kept his eyes on me, as if seeking answers in the silence. I observed them quietly, memorizing each face. They were an imperfect group, full of flaws, doubts, and fears, but they were the ones who would carry the mission forward. I rose without a word, picking up a basin of water and a towel. The murmurs ceased as they realized what I was doing. Peter frowned, his confusion quickly turning into protest. "Lord, what are you doing?" he asked, leaning forward. Without answering, I knelt before him and poured water over his feet. The sound of the water seemed louder than usual, echoing through the room. Peter recoiled slightly, his face flushed with embarrassment. "No, Lord," he said, his voice firm. "You shall never wash my feet. This is unworthy of you." I looked up at him, letting the silence carry the lesson before speaking. "If I do not wash you, Peter, you will have no part with me." He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. Finally, he relented, though not without his usual passion. "Then, Lord, not just my feet, but also my hands and head." I smiled softly, drying his feet. "The one who is already clean needs only to wash his feet." I continued with each of the disciples, and the atmosphere seemed to shift with every gesture. Some were visibly uncomfortable, while others accepted in silence. When I reached Judas, the air felt almost electrified. He avoided my gaze, but I knew he felt the weight of the moment. I poured water over his feet and dried them with the same care I had shown the others. I did not speak, but my silence was as clear a message as any words could be. When I finished, I stood and set the towel aside. "Do you understand what I have done?" I asked, looking at each of them. "I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet. You also should wash one another's feet. This is the example I leave for you." They nodded, some more confused than others. The lesson had not yet fully sunk in, but I knew that, in time, it would. I took the bread and held it in my hands. The sound of the bread breaking felt almost sacred in the silence that followed. "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." I distributed the pieces, and as they ate, I could see a mixture of reverence and confusion in their eyes. I picked up the cup of wine and held it under the lamplight. "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you. Drink from it, all of you." As I passed the cup, my eyes met John's. He seemed to grasp something that the others could not yet understand. Judas, on the other hand, held the cup for a moment longer before passing it on. "Not all of you are clean," I said, my voice calm but heavy. "One of you will betray me." The uproar was immediate. Peter stood abruptly, pointing at Judas. "Who could do such a thing? Surely it's not me." The others murmured, each questioning themselves and one another. "Is it I, Lord?" I looked at Judas but did not call him by name. He understood. His eyes finally met mine, and for a moment, he seemed to wrestle with himself. Then, he rose abruptly and left, the door closing behind him with a sound that echoed like a final note. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. After Judas' departure, the silence in the upper room was deafening. All eyes were fixed on me, but I could feel the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in each of their minds. They glanced at one another, confused and uneasy, as though waiting for someone to stand and confess. Peter, unable to remain silent any longer, finally spoke. "Lord, who is it?" His voice trembled, filled with indignation and fear. "Who could do this to you? It cannot be one of us." I looked at him, my heart heavy with his need for certainty. "It is the one who has dipped his hand with me in the dish," I replied, without mentioning Judas by name. I saw Peter's eyes narrow, as though he were replaying every detail of the evening in his mind. But his attention quickly returned to me. "I would never do such a thing, Lord," he said passionately. "Even if everyone else here abandons you, I never will." My voice was filled with sorrow as I replied, "Peter, you love me, but before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." Peter's expression was a mix of shock and pain. He opened his mouth to protest but closed it again, unable to find the words. A struggle played out in his eyes, a battle between the love he felt for me and the fear that was beginning to take hold. The other disciples were equally tense. James and John looked at Peter in disbelief, while Andrew averted his gaze, as though unwilling to face the possibility of betrayal or weakness among them. I tried to ease the weight of the atmosphere by turning my attention back to the bread and wine. I took the cup in my hands once more and lifted it. The lamplight reflected off the liquid, creating a deep crimson glow. "Drink from this cup," I said, my voice firm yet full of love. "It is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples obeyed in silence, each holding the cup as though it were something sacred, though they did not yet fully understand. "Do this in remembrance of me," I continued. "Whenever you eat this bread and drink from this cup, remember what I have done for you." John, sitting closest to me, seemed to absorb the meaning of my words. His gaze met mine, and I could see that he was beginning to understand. Not completely, but enough to strengthen his faith. Meanwhile, James broke the silence. "Lord," he asked hesitantly, "why must you leave? Can't we face this together?" "All that is about to happen has already been written," I explained, striving to convey serenity even as I felt the weight of the moment. "I must fulfill what the Father has ordained. But know this, I leave you peace. My peace I give to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." Even so, I noticed that many of them were still consumed by their doubts. Thomas, in particular, appeared restless. "Lord," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, "how can we follow without you? How will we know the way?" "I am the way, the truth, and the life," I replied, looking directly at him. "No one comes to the Father except through me. Trust in me, Thomas." As I spoke, I observed how my disciples clung to my words, trying to find in them the strength they would need in the days ahead. But I knew that full understanding would only come later. As the lamps began to burn lower, signaling the advancing night, I asked the disciples to rise. The upper room felt emptier without Judas, yet his absence left an echo no one could ignore. "Let us go," I said, my voice calm. "The hour is near." The disciples exchanged nervous glances but followed me as I led them outside. We walked through the silent streets of Jerusalem, now almost deserted. The sounds of the celebrations had faded, and the echoes of our footsteps reverberated against the stone streets. Peter walked beside me, still restless, while James and John spoke in hushed tones behind us. I sensed the growing tension within the group. Thomas once again seemed lost in thought, while Andrew and Philip walked farther back, murmuring quietly to one another. When we arrived at Gethsemane, the garden's stillness seemed to envelop them, but to me, the peace of the place was an illusion. The weight of what was to come was overwhelming, and I knew the night would not end without pain. Before entering the heart of the garden, I stopped and turned to the disciples. "Sit here while I go and pray," I instructed. "Watch and pray so that you do not fall into temptation." I chose Peter, James, and John to accompany me. They were the ones who had always shown the closest bond, and I wanted them near me at this moment. As we moved away from the others, I stopped beneath an olive tree and looked at them intently. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," I confessed. "Stay here and keep watch with me." The three nodded, but I could see they were already beginning to struggle against their weariness. I stepped a little farther away and knelt on the ground. The cold earth pressed against my hands, and the night scent felt sharper than ever. "Father," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "if it is possible, take this cup from me." My breathing grew heavier, and I felt my body tremble as the words left me. The agony I experienced in that moment was indescribable, not only because of the physical pain I knew awaited me, but also because of the weight of all humanity's sins beginning to fall upon me. "Yet not my will, but yours be done," I concluded, allowing my surrender to be complete. As I prayed, drops of sweat formed on my forehead, mingling with the blood that now began to flow slowly. It was as though my body was responding to the spiritual pressure I faced. I returned to the disciples and found them sleeping. Peter was leaning against a tree, his head slumped to one side, while James and John were curled up, breathing deeply. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" I asked, my voice heavy with sadness. "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." They awoke with a start, murmuring apologies. I knew it wasn't a lack of love, but a result of human frailty. I stepped away again to pray, feeling the tension within me intensify. The third time I returned, I found them sleeping once more. I did not wake them. I stood for a moment, watching them, before turning to face the sound that now pierced the silence, approaching footsteps and voices. "The traitor is coming," I announced, my voice resolute. As the sound of steps and voices grew louder in the distance, I felt the tension among the disciples rise. They glanced at one another, as if the mere closeness of their companions could provide comfort. Peter, with clenched fists, stepped forward to stand beside me, his breathing heavy and uneven. "Lord," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "no matter who betrays you, I will never abandon you. I am ready to die for you." There was something deeply sincere in Peter's words, but also a blindness. He did not understand what lay ahead or how fear could seep into even the strongest of hearts. I placed my hand on his shoulder, fixing my gaze on his. "Peter," I said calmly, "before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny 3 times that you know me." Peter shook his head in protest. "That will never happen," he exclaimed, his voice nearly breaking under the intensity of his conviction. "I am loyal, Lord. I was the first to follow you. I would never deny what we have done together." I observed him for a moment, letting the silence fill the space between us. It was not my intention to diminish his loyalty, but to prepare him for the reality of his weakness. "You speak with love," I replied, my voice gentle, "but the time to test your heart is near. Even so, Peter, do not fear. When you rise again, strengthen your brothers." Peter said nothing, but his expression revealed the turmoil within. He stepped back slightly, his face marked by a mixture of doubt and sorrow. The other disciples watched, puzzled. John remained close, his gaze fixed on me as though trying to grasp every word I spoke. James and Andrew murmured quietly to one another, likely trying to make sense of what I had said to Peter. As the sounds of footsteps grew even closer, I turned back to the group. "What is about to happen must happen," I said, my voice steady. "You do not need to understand it now, but know this: the Father is with me." Before the soldiers came into view, I seized the moments that remained. I wanted to leave them with words that would echo even after I was gone, something they could hold on to in the darkest days to come. "Listen carefully," I began, gathering them around me. The garden was silent, except for the soft rustling of the wind through the olive trees. The moonlight bathed their faces, and I could see the blend of apprehension and expectation in their eyes. "Love one another," I said, my voice filled with tenderness. "Just as I have loved you, you also must love one another. By this love, everyone will know that you are my disciples." A gentle murmur spread among them. Some nodded, like John, who always seemed to grasp lessons with his heart before his mind. Others, like James and Philip, maintained serious expressions, absorbing each word carefully. "Your unity will be your strength," I continued. "I am the vine, and you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in them will bear much fruit. Without me, you can do nothing." Thomas furrowed his brow, his expression revealing the question he finally decided to voice. "Lord, how will we remain in you if you are not with us? How will we know what to do?" I looked at him with patience. "Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But I will not leave you as orphans. I will send the Comforter, the Spirit of truth. He will be with you and guide you." The sound of the wind seemed to carry my words, and I saw the tension on their faces ease slightly. Yet there were still many questions, doubts they didn't know how to articulate. "Remember this," I continued. "In this world, you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world." My words seemed to bring some peace, but I still saw a glimmer of uncertainty in Peter's eyes and in those of the others. It was natural. They knew something was about to change, but they could not grasp the full extent of what it meant. "Lord," Philip spoke hesitantly, "what should we do when you are no longer here? How will we carry on without you?" I approached Philip and placed my hand on his shoulder. "You will not be without me," I replied. "The presence of the Spirit will be enough to remind you of everything I have taught. Trust in this." The moon continued its slow journey across the sky, and I felt that time was running out. I knew that soon the moments of peace would be replaced by confusion and pain. Yet there was a stillness in my heart, for I knew that every word I had spoken would come to pass. "Let us rise now," I said finally, breaking the silence that had formed. "The hour has come." The disciples stood, some still hesitant but all ready to follow. The sound of voices and footsteps was now very near. I could see the light of torches cutting through the trees, casting long, unsettling shadows. As we began to move toward the inevitable, I looked at each of them, silently giving thanks for their presence, their imperfections, and their love. As we moved through Gethsemane, the silence of the garden seemed to amplify every sound: the rustling of the leaves, the soft wind among the trees, the hurried steps in the distance. The disciples were tense, and I could see their expressions shifting between fear and confusion. They knew something was about to happen, but they could not predict what lay ahead. I stopped at the center of the garden and looked around. This place, which had so often been our refuge, now felt burdened with a different weight. Its stillness was not one of peace but of anticipation. "Sit here," I instructed, my voice low but firm. "Watch and pray so that you do not fall into temptation." I watched as most of the disciples settled in, some murmuring quietly among themselves. Their movements were slow, as though even their physical exhaustion was beginning to overtake them. I chose Peter, James, and John to come with me a little farther. We walked together in silence until I turned to them, feeling the weight of the moment overflow. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," I confessed, my voice trembling. "Stay here and keep watch with me." The three nodded, but their eyes reflected a mixture of fear and incomprehension. I knew they could not fully grasp what was happening within me, but I wanted them to understand that their presence mattered. Leaving them there, I moved a little farther away, until I found a place where I could be alone with the Father. Kneeling at the foot of an olive tree, The scent of the damp earth rose around me as I placed my hands on the ground. "Father," I began, my voice barely a whisper, "if it is possible, take this cup from me." The words came out laden with pain, each one like a blade cutting through my heart. I knew the cup I was asking to be taken was unavoidable, but the weight of its reality was nearly unbearable. "Yet," I continued, allowing every word to be an act of surrender, "not my will, but yours be done." My breathing grew heavier, and I felt my body begin to tremble. Sweat poured from my face, mingling with the blood that now emerged from my skin. The spiritual intensity of the battle I faced went beyond the physical. It was as though all the pain, sin, and darkness of the world were being laid upon me. Slowly, I stood and returned to where Peter, James, and John were. But I found them asleep, their heads resting against the trunks of the surrounding trees. The sight struck me with a gentle sadness. "Peter," I called, my voice filled with lament. He woke with a start, rubbing his eyes. James and John also stirred, their expressions confused and embarrassed. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" I asked, my tone more sorrowful than reproachful. "Watch and pray so that you do not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." They nodded, murmuring apologies. I stepped away again, returning to the place where I had prayed earlier. The weight in my heart felt even heavier now, but I continued to pray, once more surrendering myself to the Father's plan. When I returned the second time, I found them asleep again. This time, I did not wake them. I stood for a moment, observing them. Their faces were marked by fatigue, but there was an innocence about them that reminded me why I was doing all of this. The third time I returned, I could already hear the sound of footsteps and voices in the distance. The light of torches flickered through the trees, their shadows dancing on the stones of the garden. "Rise," I said, my voice firm. "The one who is going to betray me is here." The voices grew louder, and soon the soldiers appeared in the distance, led by Judas. He walked ahead, his steps hesitant, though there was a calculated determination in his posture. The torches they carried cast unsettling shadows on the ground, and the clinking of their armor mingled with the crunch of their boots on the earth. The disciples, now fully awake, stood suddenly, confused and frightened. Peter stepped forward, his hand already reaching for the sword he carried. "Lord," he murmured, "is it time? Shall I fight?" I raised my hand to stop him. "No, Peter," I replied firmly. "Everything that is happening must happen. The kingdom will not be established by the sword." Judas was now only a few steps away from me. For a moment, he hesitated, and our eyes met. I saw the internal struggle on his face, the guilt consuming him, but also the choice he had already made. "Friend," I said, my voice calm yet filled with sorrow, "is it with a kiss that you betray me?" He did not answer. Slowly, he stepped closer and leaned in to touch my face with a kiss. His touch was cold, but his hands trembled visibly. I could feel his shaky breath, as if he were trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. The soldiers moved in quickly. Before I could speak, Peter drew his sword and struck, cutting off the ear of one of the men. The wounded man's cry echoed through the garden, followed by the metallic sound of swords being drawn. "Peter, put your sword away," I commanded, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Do you not know that I could call on my Father, and he would send legions of angels to save me? But how, then, would the scriptures be fulfilled?" I knelt and touched the wounded man's ear, restoring it. He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and fear but said nothing. The disciples were paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. I turned to the soldiers and said, "If you are looking for me, let these men go." They hesitated but obeyed, turning their full attention to me. I felt the cords tighten around my wrists as they bound me, but the peace in my heart did not waver. One by one, the disciples began to retreat, fleeing into the shadows of the garden. Peter looked at me one last time before disappearing among the trees, his expression filled with pain and confusion. Judas remained standing for a moment, watching as the soldiers led me away. His face was pale, and his eyes brimmed with tears. "Judas," I called, my voice gentle even as I was being taken. "There is still time to turn back." He lowered his head and stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. As they led me toward the city, I felt a profound peace in my heart. The Father's plan was unfolding, and even in the darkness of that night, I knew that the light would prevail.